We are continuing our read and commentary of the Nag Hammadi library. We're on Codex number 5 and text number 3, titled The First Apocalypse of James. As usual, let's do a backdrop of this particular text, and from there we will begin the reading commentary. This first Apocalypse of James obviously is a Gnostic apocalyptic writing. Its initial rediscovery was a Coptic translation as the third tractate of Codex V in the Nag Hammadi library. Additionally, copies were later found in Coptic as part of the Codex Chakos and in the Greek among the Oxyrhynchus papyri. The text uses Valentinian Theologomena, leading to the belief the original document was written in c. 200 AD. The content of the text is a dialogue between Jesus and James the Just. The text prepares Jesus for his death as a martyr by emphasizing spiritual redemption over material existence. And I'm going to start first in this video with the number 72. That is very significant in this particular text, but often is brought up in Gnosticism and in other ways. It's referred to as the part of the Habdomad, and Habdomad has many different potential meanings. Anything that makes up a subset of 7. For example, a week can be a Habdomad because it's made up of 7 days. You could have a total of 7 weeks that make up a total time period, or 7 years. Especially the Jewish, they have the 7 years, and on the 7th day you rest. Or God, or the Elohim, creating the heaven and earth in 7 days, and on the 7th day resting. So you see the significant 7 being brought up quite often. And even in Gnosticism, the number 7 is brought up quite often when it's referring to the 7 lights or the 7 luminaries, sometimes referred also to as the 12 luminaries, or the 12 lights, or the 12 globes or spheres of influence. And then, of course, you have 12 is another very significant number in Gnosticism as well. 6 is the number of man, and the spiritual number is 7. And then you have 6 being the perfect number in Greece or Greek thought, and number 12 being the perfect number in the Jewish sort of way of thinking. And the Jewish, of course, had the 12 sons of Jacob, I think it was. And then you had of course, the 12 disciples, the 12 nations of Israel. And of course, in the book of Revelation, you have the 7 candlesticks and the 7 stars and the 7 kings on the 7 hills. So 7, number 12, and number 6 and number 3, making up the 3 parts of the human, the so-called Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. So these are the numbers that you see time and again within the Christian mythos, or the way of thinking. But in this particular book, number 72 is brought up. I wanted to read from BibleStudy.org referring to the number 72, and it does lay out various different ways 72 might appear in the Bible, or maybe translated to mean something symbolically, or have its meaning in some way, by taking various different texts from the Bible. But what I want to specifically focus on is the section under Jewish tradition when it talks about angelology, because of the way Christ talks about it in the Apocalypse of James. It says here that the Jewish angelology teaches that there are 70 angels that each act as a heavenly guardian, a prince over a nation. Around that particular time, the thought is there really were 70 primary nations. 2 principal nations, but we're going to get to that in a second. But there really were initially 70 primary languages. Now, of course, all these different tribes of people have interspersed and mixed together, and now we've got literally over 7,000 supposed quote-unquote languages. It goes on to say this concept of the world composed of 70 nations or peoples is partly based on Genesis 10. This chapter delineates 70 peoples, 26 from Shem, 30 from Ham, and 14 from Japheth, who were born after the flood. It is also believed that Michael, as Israel's angel prince, has been set as ruler over the 70 with God over it. It is these 72 beings, according to this angelology, which sit in council when holding judgment over the world. You have 72 beings arbitrating for the 70 different nations or types of people or kinds of people on the planet. So this is what's being suggested. Genesis 10 in the King James Bible lists 72 descendants from Shem, 30 from Ham and 14 from Japheth. The Septuagint, however, a Greek-based version of the Hebrew Old Testament, is somewhat different. It lists 27 descendants from Shem and 15 from Japheth, for 72 total from all three sons of Noah. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, when we had the Secret Book of John, it mentioned 72 different types of demons. Those 72 had a total of 365 beneath them, and above them were a total of 7 or 12, just depending on their grouping. But in this case, we also understand that each one of those were to represent a total of 3 days of darkness, because they were the demons, right? And in this case, the 3 days of darkness could be thought of in science as the 3 days before the longest day of the year, which usually falls somewhere between the 22nd and the 25th. And then, of course, supposedly Christ was born on the 24th of December, at least in the Western world, that's how it's celebrated. But there's a lot of evidence that suggests that if Jesus was actually born and walked the earth, that the evidence pointing more toward a September or October-ish time frame. But also just the way the Bible is written, with the manger and the way they describe the weather and how it lines up with his resurrection, all that timeline points more toward that time. But the point here is that, again, not only you have those 3 days and 3 nights, but which are the darker nights of the year, at least in the northern hemisphere, but you also have Christ, of course, that died in 3 days, rose, which is a total of 72 hours. And then you got a total of 7 planets that were known at that time. And again, we're talking about the spheres versus the luminaries. The luminaries are representing the pleroma, and the spheres represented in the archetypical way here in this realm. But now we've discovered, of course, additional 5 planets. Now we're including the sun and the moon in that lineup. And astrologically, it turns out there are 12 planets, right? The 12 disciples, so forth and so on. So we're moving from the what Greeks would consider to be the perfect number 6. Jewish lore, 12 is considered the significant number. Okay, so with that, take with it what you will. We're going to basically read from this text. When we run into that section, I'm just going to speculate what's being referred to in that section is there are 72 angels or archangels, or archons really, that rule over these 7 planets, and it lines up with the Jewish tradition, their teaching on the number 72. And those spiritual beings, judging and counseling for the humans on earth. Christ talks about this. Another significant place this is mentioned is in the Bible, in Luke chapter 10. Although it doesn't really specify why, in chapter 10 it says, after this is after Christ took the fish and made it into thousands of fish and loaves, and he talked to his disciples about his crucifixion, all of this, the Sermon on the Mount, all of this. After he had done all that, and he sent them out, the 12 out, to talk about the good news and spread his gospel. Then after that, in chapter 10, Christ appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. He told them, the harvest is plenty, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Go, I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves. Do not take a purse or bag or sandals, and do not greet anyone on the road. Now, I think it's interesting again, because here he's referring to him sending 72 others out beyond his 12 disciples. And then in this text and in the angelology that 72 is brought up in the 72 primary languages, 72 primary nations of the world before it became many more. Anyway, that's the backdrop. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and begin our reading and commentary of the first apocalypse of James, in this case translated by William R. Skudell. It is written here, "It is the Lord who spoke with me. Quote, see now the completion of my redemption. I have given you a sign of these things, James, my brother. For not without reason have I called you my brother, although you were not my brother materially. And I am not ignorant concerning you, so that when I give you a sign, no one hear." So whatever that sign is, either he talked about it before, this sort of in media res, or we're going to hear about it here in a second. But I did read through this, of course, already, and, we're just going to have to kind of guess. But I'm getting a clear understanding what the sign is exactly. Nothing existed except him who is. He is unnameable and ineffable. Of course, he's talking about the true Father, the Mother, the monad, right? I myself am also unnameable from him who is. So he's again talking about we're all of the same substance, really. I'm also like him. And he's setting this up because later on he's going to mention you too, James, are like him who is. And this is the whole ideology that, have I not said ye are gods, that we're moving away from this idea that there's just this one God who gets to rule over everybody. It kind of reminds me even Lord of the Rings, right? But this sort of authoritarian or authoritative approach versus free will and independent autonomous thinking is at the core of Gnosticism compared to the orthodox understanding of the way humans should relate to self, other, the universe, and God. And I am before you. Since you have asked concerning femaleness existed. This is important because it's brought up quite often in Gnosticism, and it's not that much talked about in the canonical text. Women are sort of just a sidebar. But Gnosticism, it takes on a very significant role because you have Sophia, who's one of the core characters in the story. She's a balance to the Christ figure. She's just as important, no less or no more. But also, you can see how each one of these disciples are struggling with this idea females are at that same level as men. Because remember, they come from a very patriarchal understanding of mindset. And so they're very concerned. It can be threatening to many of them. Or for others, it can be a kind of discovery, and it's very fascinating. And so apparently James had asked about it. How do women fit into this? And how are we to think of them? And Christ says, they've always been, like they existed before you even. But femaleness was not first. Now, when we think about femaleness, we're thinking about what in Hebrew way of thinking, and not just among the Hebrews, but this has been pretty much throughout time, at least humans in modern time, are considered the weaker sex, and men the stronger sex. And women generally, they're the ones that are somehow responsible for Achilles' heel of humanity. And the man has to rescue the damsel in distress. But this dynamic is what gives man his sort of passion to go out and become the protector and the hero of the story. And then he gets acclaim. And the female sits in the backdrop and admires him from afar and, of course, champions him and glorifies him as well, along with all the other beta males, right, in this case. In this case, we're saying that, no, it's that in Gnosticism, the understanding is something quite different. It is that, yes, female is the weaker sex, but weakness is not something that's considered less. It's not considered inferior. It's considered something that is essential because it points to something very specific. When we think about stronger, we're thinking about the physical realm. We're thinking about physical things. We're thinking about that man is strong, and he puts much emphasis on his prowess, his physical prowess, because he identifies with the outward appearance. He identifies with the physical body. He identifies with a woman even as something physical, or their own bodies as something physical to be admired, get big muscles and be admired by other men. And look at what I can do, look how much I can weigh, how much I can beat this other nation with brute force, a force of soldiers. And that is what's considered to be strength, and that's what's considered to be righteous, and that's what's considered to be the proper place of things on the hierarchy, and it's hierarchical in nature. And this puts men in his proper place, head of the household, the image of God, and women is just sort of an afterthought, a sort of supporting role, right? She's there, the homemaker, to keep the house hearthy and warm and ready the food, sort of like a servant, really, to kind of be there when he's in the mood, so forth and so on. But in Gnosticism, women are weaker, maybe physically, but in the outer world, but internally, women are stronger and men are weaker. So this creates a kind of yin and yang, a way in which, again, you got to remember that Christ talked about what God put together, let no man put asunder. Let no one put asunder. And of course, in chapter 2 Genesis, well, the Lord comes along and he separates. He separates the male, takes a rib out of him and creates female. So he basically cleaves the woman from the man. Meaning, in other words, man began to identify with his physical self. He saw his nakedness. So you got to remember that. That's what it's talking about. He began to see he was ashamed of himself. And from then on, his femaleness within, meaning his emptiness, his lack of fulfillment, his insecurities, made him then go out and strive to become something, quote unquote something, not realizing he already was something. This is the femaleness that's being talked about. So we're not talking about actual genitalia here. We're not talking about men and women in the sex sense, but rather in the way that things are accomplished, brought about, whether it be through aggression or assertiveness or passively through consideration. And female is more of that way, consideration and passive. It's the rest, it's the repose. And man is action. He's the will, blindly just sort of going wherever it wants to go. Hit the target is all that matters. Doesn't matter how many arrows go out and how many misses and what is destroyed in its path. And of course, then woman lovingly, or rather the female lovingly shapes it through wisdom. Okay, but the gnosis is that driving will, you see. And so the Gnosticism really talks about how men and women together, not in the sex sense, but female and male together, like that's what our original state was. We were synergistic and we were whole. But Christ is saying here, femaleness existed even before you, James. So he's basically implying to James, yes, you've got to respect this. And it's that the woman generally has been taught to kind of carry that way of being, to get things done, in that way, right? But femaleness was not first. And so the first intention was the thought. And the thought is not the mind. The mind is the female. It's the receptacle. The thought is the first action from the monad. So that was that was the male that asserted its will. But that will just sort of blindly went out, and then the female caressed it and shaped it through its wisdom. And so the female came after that. And it prepared for itself powers and gods. And that forming created limitation, a consequence of the way these two actions or ways of behaving result. But it did not exist when I came forth, since I am an image of him who is. But I have brought forth the image of him, so that the sons of him who is might know what things are theirs and what things are alien to them. Now here Christ is hinting at that this world is alien to us, and that the things that are really ours are everything that is the Christ and everything that is the monads. And this idea of the female is that thing that's lacking. Because everybody, remember in Thomas it talked about how when women recognize that they are at the level of men, or they become as men, meaning in other words, they take on that degree of understanding of value and worthiness to receive God's love and glory and valueness, then in that instance there's heaven. There will be fullness. That is the thing that's been talked about here. So, behold, I shall reveal to you everything of this mystery. Mystery is, again, that everything has been talked about. For they will seize me the day after tomorrow, but my redemption will be near. So he's talking about his resurrection. So he's going to be taken right to the cross here. And he's telling James this. James says, Rabbi, you have said they will seize me, but what can I do? He said to me, Fear not, James, you too will they seize. But leave Jerusalem, for it is she who always gives the cup of bitterness to the sons of light. And this is an interesting statement, because remember, it was the Adam and Eve who were captivated by and led, and the curse was placed on them by the demiurge, the Jehovah God. And then they would carry that burden, which is the law. They carried that law. That's why Jewish or Jerusalem, money, power, and anything relating to law, judicial, came from the same stem as we get the word Jewish. And all money was in the form of jewelry initially, until it was coined. But even then it was a piece of jewelry that was formed, whether it be coins of gold or rubies or silver, etc. They're all jewelry, basically. So jewelry, judge, all of those come from Jerusalem, is what's saying. The law, anything to do with the way that this world's constructed, that you have to earn your worth. And you can't just be worthy intrinsically. This is what causes the Masonry. This is what causes everybody to go out and follow the captains, and they put you into war, or they put you into slavery and destitute, and you've got to go out and work to earn your worth in order to just be worthy of living. Anyway, so for it is she who always gives the cup of bitterness to the sons of light. She is a dwelling place of a great number of Archons. So these Archons, when we talk about them, in previous Gnostic text, we always kind of heard about them in a way that almost sounded like they were up in the heavens somewhere, right? They were up and beyond the clouds, or they were, up in the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth heaven, and they were up there and they just were looking down on the humans. But here Christ is telling James, no, they're walking among you on earth. So this is very substantial piece of information that we're getting here, right? Like, this is very illustrative. Now, it makes come in your mind like, wow, these Archons are walking among us, right? But your redemption will be preserved from them, so that you may understand who they are and what kinds they are. Now here's where it gets fragmentary, so I can only guess. Christ says, you will ... and listen. They are not ... but Archons ... These 12 ... down ... Archons ... upon his own habdomad. And again, now this is the first time he's saying that word, upon his own habdomad. So it's saying there's 7 primary archangels, and then there are 12 on top of that, like for each one of the 7. But we're going to get to that in a second. And James said, Rabbi, are there then 12 habdomads? And not 7, as there are in the scriptures? So again, whether we're talking about spheres, planets, because remember the Greeks, many times they worship, some sects actually worship the planets as gods, and others says, no, they're just representations or symbolic of the gods, and that's where maybe they came from or whatever. Zeus was not in fact Jupiter, but others would say, no, Jupiter and Zeus are the same thing. But here, whether you think of it that way, or you think of their archetypical ways of thinking in a more psychological or social psychological way, or you think of them in a more spiritual way, they're angels, or maybe they're aliens, if you want to think of it that way. It doesn't really matter, because all of these still create archetypes. They create sort of a Jungian model that's imprinted or superimposed onto humans, and this is sort of the way we think now throughout time, and it's all built up to now. And so formerly, the thought was that there were 7 planets, or up to Jupiter, and then eventually Saturn. But eventually it came to be found out, no, there are in fact 12. Now, whether that's including Jupiter, or the moon and the sun, and the total of the 12, because there's actually 10, or there's 2 more that have yet to be discovered. That remains to be seen. However you want to look at it, let's just say it's still 12, a total of 12 habdomads, and not 7. So that means 12, 7. So there's a total of 84. That's not matching with our 72 that we talked about earlier. But if you have 72 plus 12 more, remember there were 72 that were sent out, and then you have the 12 original, right? Then you have 84. And not 7 as there are in the scriptures. The Lord said, James, he who spoke concerning the scripture had a limited understanding. I, however, shall reveal to you what has come forth from him who has no number. And of course, he's talking about the monad words. Everything's infinite. There's no limitation. I shall give you a sign concerning their number. And as for what has come forth from him who has no measure, I shall give a sign concerning their measure. So he's going to tell them how many total archangels are there, or archons, right, that are among us on earth. You could say that they had accounted for 72 of them, or maybe even 7 of them. In this case, maybe they didn't count for the 12 disciples. So James said, Rabbi, behold then, I have received their number. There are 72 measures. All right, so the Lord said, these are the 72 heavens, which are their subordinates. These are the powers of all their might, and they were established by them. And these are they who are distributed everywhere, existing under the authority of the 12 archons. All right, so 72 heavens. It's interesting because in Gnosticism, and even sometimes the canonical text, concepts or abstract ideas are often blended. Like, for example, if we talk about an aeon, it's literally an entity. It has its own personality, right? It's an entity. But it's also an abstract idea that is a part of God. And it takes on its own sort of embodiment in each one of us. For example, eternal life is a archon, or a faith is an aeon, rather. And we all can carry faith, right? And Christ is another aeon. Christ is within us. So the same concept here is that these archons literally take up a rulership of 72 heavens, and there are 12 primary archons over them. And then it says, the inferior power among them brought forth for itself angels and unnumbered hosts. Guess he's talking about Sabaoth, because remember, Sabaoth is the angel or the Lord or the part of God that created the host of angels that were unnumbered. It was considered a lesser sort of part of the demiurge that is Jesus the Christ. He could be talking about himself. Him who is, however, has been given ... on account of ... him who is ... Again, I got it's fragmentary, so I don't know. They are unnumbered. He's basically talking about himself and everybody else, really, because we're all part of him who is. Our domain, or I wouldn't call it power because it's not really power, emissary, whatever, is unnumbered. If you want to give them a number now, you will not be able to do so until you have cast away from your blind thought this bond of flesh which encircles you. And then you will reach him who is, and you will no longer be James. Rather, you are the one who is, and all those who are unnumbered will all have been named. So you will take on their powers like this. It will be infinite. You basically have infinite life and infinite powers once you leave behind this flesh body and you ascend to the Holy Souls realm or the Pleroma, wherever you're going. So that's pretty much what I'm getting. It's a very cryptic sort of book. I'm just sharing with you the best I can take from it based on what I know of the canonical text and the Gnostic text. Alright, that wraps it up for the first video, so we'll pick back up in the next video where James says, Rabbi, in what way shall I reach him who is, since all these powers and these hosts are armed against me? So in other words, how do I get there? Because the whole world, seems to be plotting against me. They're coming after me. So how do I even get there? We'll address that in the next video. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, have a blessed day.